After the success of the original Final Fantasy, Square was poised to follow up its surprise RPG hit with a sequel as quickly as possible. Hironobu Sakaguchi set to work assembling a team and creating a brand new game, with the goal to have it on store shelves within 1 year. Most of the original staff reprised their roles for Final Fantasy II. Sakaguchi drafted the plot and Kenji Terada fleshed out the full scenario. Nobuo Uematsu returned as the composer, and Yoshitaka Amano again worked as the concept artist. Iranian American Nasir Jabeli too stayed on board as programmer. However, halfway through development, his work visa expired, and he was forced to return to the States. Sakaguchi and his team relied heavily on Jabeli's programming skills to complete the game, so the decision was made for the staff to pack up their offices and move to Sacramento, California from Japan to finish production. Hironobu Sakaguchi began development as the main planner just as before, but quickly the production for the title grew tremendously. Square allocated more funds, more resources, and more employees to ensure that Final Fantasy II would replicate the success of the first game. Sakaguchi then felt it was necessary to shift to the role of director, overseeing all facets of the project. While party creation was a central part of the original Final Fantasy, and indeed one of the most fun features according to much of the staff, Sakaguchi surmised that player-created characters limited the scope in which stories could be told. The main goal for Final Fantasy II thus was to provide a more story-driven game, even more so than its competition of Dragon Quest and others. In order to meet this goal, it was decided early on that the story would be completely separate from the previous entry. Final Fantasy II began as a truly ambitious title, and the developers have admitted that hardware limitations prevented them from creating their original concept. Early drafts of the game's story surrounded a civil war of the Kingdom of Altair, in which King Basil II and his sons Philip, Richard, and Roger all battled for the throne. The story was designed to change depending on how much fame players would receive by completing tasks, as well as giving the player good and evil options in some situations that would lead down different paths. The plot was also to cover a large span of time, and the game's world would evolve to reflect this. Of course, these elements would find their way onto the cutting room floor, and what was ultimately released had a radically different plot, though still some lofty ambitions. Final Fantasy II centers around the rise of the Palamecian Empire, which is led by the power-hungry Emperor Matthias. The Emperor uses his twisted magic to summon monsters from the depths of hell, and commands this army to conquer the world in his honor. A resistance group called the Wild Rose Rebellion, and led by Princess Hilda, forms to stop the Emperor, though they are quickly uncovered. Emperor Matthias launches an attack on the rebel headquarters in the city of Fynn, where war orphans Firion, Guy, Maria, and her brother Leon reside. The group attempts to escape, but in the chaos, Leon becomes separated and is presumed dead. This event inspires the trio to join the rebellion in the fight against Palamecia and bring Emperor Matthias' vile rule to an end. Much of Final Fantasy II's strength comes from its distinct characters and more powerful story than its contemporaries. The three lead protagonists have personalities, motivations, and backstories, although they can at times fall into some stereotypical roles that can limit their overall appeal. Firion is your typical hero who fights to protect those he holds dear. Maria's motives of avenging her brother's demise is well done, but more often than not, she serves as the token female of the group. Her beauty is frequently mentioned. She is hit on by many male characters, and at one point, she has an emotional breakdown that requires the strength of her comrades to overcome. Guy, sometimes translated as Gus, is your standard muscle-bound warrior. Guy was raised by wild animals, so while he possesses great combat abilities, his speech and understanding is limited. This leads many to perceive him as dumb, and as such he stays silent most of the time. Guy does have a deeper understanding of nature than most others though, and he can even commune with animals when the need arises. The fourth character slot is reserved for a revolving cast of party members, and it is with these guests that some of the game's best story sequences are formed. These characters interject much more personality than the main protagonists and become the outright stars of their chapters of the plot. While you begin the game with Maria's brother Leon, you'll later be accompanied by such characters as Minwu, a white mage who is Princess Hilda's advisor, Layla, a reformed pirate who joins the rebellion after being bested by the party, and Prince Gordon of Kashwan, who takes up his spear in a quest of redemption to prove himself a worthy leader. Although Final Fantasy II differs greatly from much of the rest of the series, it does establish many staples that have become synonymous with the franchise. The term High Wind, for instance, was first used in Final Fantasy II and has appeared across the series as a surname, a weapon, an ability, or even a location. In this case, it is the name of the character Rickard Highwind, sometimes named Gareth or Edward in some translations. Rickard is the last of the Dragoons, which is another iconic term in the series, and is used to describe spear-wielding knights that sometimes befriend dragons. The character Cid is also introduced in Final Fantasy II, and has been used in every subsequent Final Fantasy title, although Cid is a different character in each of these games. He almost always has a strong connection to another series motif, airships. In Final Fantasy II, Cid is a white knight turned entrepreneur who ferries travelers through the skies on his airships powered by sunfire. He later entrusts his personal ship to Firion, so he may use it to reach the flying Palamecian castle. Also, the Crystals of Power make a return in Final Fantasy II, though to a far lesser degree. They appear towards the end game, where they boost the stats of your party members and can teach the forbidden spell Ultima, one of the most powerful magic abilities in the entire franchise. Some of the most recognizable creatures in the Final Fantasy franchise are Chocobos. These feathered mounts have had varied uses throughout the series, from transporting you across long distances to aiding in minigames and even as summonable allies in battle. They become a sort of series mascot, along with quite a few other characters and monsters, but few others have had their very own games like Chocobo Racing and Chocobo's Mystery Dungeon. Chocobos make their very first appearance in Final Fantasy II. A forest in which they all live is found just south of the Kingdom of Kashwan, and these friendly birds can provide a speedy ride to the city of Bafsk and other nearby areas. Final Fantasy II also takes a large inspiration from the Star Wars series, which is seen largely in its plot. There are many similarities that cannot be overlooked, such as the cruel totalitarian empire ruled by a magic-wielding leader who is, initially, only referred to as Emperor. While Star Wars' Emperor Palpatine has the iconic Darth Vader who serves him, Emperor Mateus has his own follower, and a mysterious knight who wears solid black armor. The rebellions that rise to confront these terrors in both stories are also led by a princess, though as far as I know, Hilda's not the secret twin of Firion or anything. This leads us to the game's primary villains. There are three major antagonists in Final Fantasy II: Emperor Mateus, his servant, the Dark Knight, and the traitorous Count Borgen. Borgen once served the Kingdom of Kashwan, but becomes a turncoat after Palamecia promises him power in exchange for ensuring that the city of Fynn falls. Borgen is a cowardly man, often throwing his minions at the party as if they were truly disposable. He holds great contempt towards the party, blaming them for the survival of the Wild Rose Rebellion, and in turn holding the rebellion responsible for ruining his standing with the Emperor. He eventually dies rather easily to the party's hands, though in his death, he springs one final trap that proves fatal for one of the rebellion's allies. The Dark Knight proves a much more formidable adversary than the Count. He wields great power, both in the Imperial Army's ranks as well as in his combat abilities. He oversees the construction of the Dreadnought, a Death Star-like air fortress capable of leveling an entire city with a single blast. This isn't the only other similarity the Dark Knight has with Star Wars' most notable villain, as he too has a close connection with one of the lead protagonists. It's revealed late in the journey that the Dark Knight is actually Maria's brother Leon, who has turned against his homeland and joined forces with the Emperor's evil army. It isn't explained exactly why Leon became evil. Perhaps he is just another victim of the Emperor's vile magic, which has been used to warp his heart, making him willing to strike down his own sister, if need be. Emperor Matthias is truly one of the Final Fantasy franchise's most evil and powerful antagonists. He has untold amounts of power. At one point he summons a massive cyclone that totally destroys numerous towns and which serves as a barrier to protect his floating fortress. Towards the end of the game, the Emperor is slain by the party, and the Dark Knight seizes control of his evil forces. Just as the heroes are about to do battle with the Dark Knight, Emperor Matthias rises again in a more threatening demon form. He reveals that his goal was to be killed in battle and have his soul sent directly to hell. Only then could he inherit a new, unholy form that possesses even more power than his earthly body. With his newfound abilities, Matthias defeats the ruler of the underworld, seizes control of Hell's army, and returns to continue his campaign against mankind. With control of his undead army, Matthias proclaims that he has no more use for the Empire, and casts the Dark Knight away like a worthless doll. In order to stop him, the heroes must travel to Hell itself, breach the demonic castle of Pandemonium, and slay the Emperor in the underworld, ending his rule once and for all. While the story for Final Fantasy's second entry was greatly overhauled from the original, the core gameplay remains much the same. Players will explore a large open world, visit towns to stock up on gear and take on quests, then move on to labyrinthine dungeons where they'll enter into random encounters with vicious enemies, uncover lost treasures, and take on mighty bosses. The party will sometimes commandeer vehicles to aid them in their travels, such as canoes to move down rapid-flowing rivers, snowmobiles to maneuver icy terrain, and of course massive airships to soar above the land. Dungeons remain exciting places to plunder, with numerous paths that lead to both traps and treasure. The one annoyance with dungeons this go around is that there are so many trap rooms, where as soon as you enter you're forced into combat. Towards the game's end, I personally tried to avoid going through most doorways just to avoid this nuisance. To enhance the role-playing aspect of the game's story, the developers invented a feature called the word memory system. Sometimes, during conversation with other characters, special key words will be highlighted to which the player can memorize for later. With these known words, the player can then ask other characters that they encounter about these words, sometimes gaining unique dialogue options, useful information, or unlock secrets. Similarly, there are some items that can be discovered that work much the same way. The word memory feature is heavily inspired by tabletop RPGs, and it does help make conversations and investigations feel a little more realistic compared to other role-playing games of the day. Unfortunately, though, it would be a system that would not be used in any other Final Fantasy games. One new feature that would be used in most all other Final Fantasy entries is the magic point system. Made popular in Dragon Quest, the magic point system gives each spell a MP cost, which is subtracted from the character's total MP reserve. This allows for a bit more flexibility than the method used in the previous Final Fantasy. Here, characters can use any spell as many times as they want until they expend their MP points. This is by far the most popular magic system in role-playing games, and has even crossed over to many other genres today. Where Final Fantasy II does greatly differ from other entries in the series is in the way characters gain experience and improve upon their skills. This is a contentious feature for many fans, and it is upon this unique setup that either draws in fans or pushes them strongly away. For starters, there are no experience points earned in battle, nor are there traditional levels for your characters to earn. Instead, each ability, attribute, spell, as well as weapon proficiency has its own individual level attached to it that you must train. Sakaguchi and team felt it didn't make logical sense that defeating an enemy with your sword meant that you could cast more spells and have greater health. The idea was that the player would nurture their characters, shaping them in the way that they want. If you want to increase your fire spell, then simply cast it until you increase its power. Need more health? Then you must take some damage first. This concept is novel and very similar to more modern RPGs such as The Elder Scrolls and Fable. It also eliminates the need for a class system, allowing all characters to be specialists in all the areas that the player deems appropriate. Problems began to show, though, in the execution of this innovative idea. The first issue is that because enemies don't give out experience points, the player can train against any enemies in the game to increase their attributes. This includes the very first baddies you encounter. It doesn't take long for you to strike them down with a single blow, and for them to injure you for minuscule amounts of damage. Thus, they are little threat to giving you a dreaded game over. Many gamers have exploited this fact and spend the initial few hours of the game relentlessly grinding these early enemies until they are at a power that makes the rest of the adventure a breeze. There's a hidden stat in the game called Battle Rank. Without going too deep into it, each enemy in the game has a rank ranging from 1 to 7, which is factored in when leveling your weapon proficiency, spells, evasion, and magic evasion. Using a low-powered spell or weapon against a high-ranking enemy will increase proficiency exponentially, while using one with a high power level against a low-ranking enemy may not award any experience at all. It's just another factor that makes leveling up in Final Fantasy II a little more confusing than in other RPGs. Of course, these early enemies can make leveling tedious because they give little damage and die so easily. That leads to our second problem, attacking your own party members. The developers enabled the ability to deal damage to your own party members to combat the status effect Confuse, which can be cured by giving your allies a quick slap and bringing them to. Again, this is a good idea in theory, but the developers didn't take into account that players would exploit this by sparring with their party and strengthening up their skills very quickly. Your party members will likely be able to hit much harder than your early opposition, so you can power up your health and defense rapidly while also strengthening your offense. Whichever method you choose, the game is still rather tedious because it takes so many actions to level up most of your spells and abilities. To strengthen your starter spells to their second iteration, for instance, you must cast them each 100 times. When going against enemies that die in a single hit, that means it will take at least several dozen battles to get to level 2. There is a workaround on this through the manner of a rather easy glitch. If you choose an action and then cancel it before you've chosen for all party members, then the game will still count this as if you've used it. It's still tedious, but it works so much faster than going through battle after battle after battle. Instead, just choose to attack, then cancel before choosing the next character's action, and do this 100 times to gain an easy level. My advice, to avoid dreadful monotony, is to do this in groups of about 10 as you go through the game. This way, you just may avoid dying from boredom as you gain experience at a reasonable rate. All of these factors make Final Fantasy II an incredibly easy RPG experience, if you take the time to grind it out. This can be said for most any RPG really, but in this game, it's particularly helpful. Without exploiting the system, the game is just way too cumbersome to play, and you'll be spending far more time in mindless battles than actually enjoying the experience. Final Fantasy II released on the Nintendo Family Computer in Japan on December 17th, 1988, exactly 1 day shy of a year of the original game's launch. The original Famicom version performed even better than the first Final Fantasy, selling approximately 800,000 units compared to the first game's 520,000. Re-releases haven't been quite as impactful, however, and despite that early success, Final Fantasy II has sold the least amount of copies of any of the first 10 mainline games in the series. Famicom Shushin Magazine, now known as Famitsu, awarded the game a score of 35 out of 40 upon release, with the 4 reviewers giving it grades of 9, 9, 9, and an 8 out of 10. At the time, it was one of the magazine's 5 highest rated games ever. More modern takes on the game, though, have been far more critical, with G4 proclaiming in 2012 that its tweaks to leveling wound up being a huge mess in the end. Nobuo Uematsu's score remains just as great as ever, however. Uematsu chose to complement the darker themes of the game's narrative by crafting some noticeably emotional tracks. The main theme for Final Fantasy II, which plays on the overworld, is soft, almost dreamlike. It's constructed using a layering effect that mimics an echo, as if someone is playing this tune somewhere off in the distance, the sound of the flute drifting down from the rolling hills and into our ears as we journey through this mystical, war-torn world. The battle theme is very similar to the original game, though in the second half, the song dips down into a lower, more ominous tone, providing a sense of peril in the midst of combat. In contrast, the now famous Chocobo theme is upbeat, whimsical, and imparts upon the cheerful, colorful birds a lovable personality. We know instantly when the song plays that we have met friends of the Resistance rather than monsters that would do us harm. After Nintendo of America translated and brought the first Final Fantasy to the US market, there were talks of bringing the second and third games as well. Shortly after the first game's release in America, Square established its Western branch, titled Squaresoft, and it was this group that began the English translations on the 2 titles. Leading the project was Kaoru Moriyama, an early pioneer translator for Japanese games, who would also be in charge of translating Final Fantasy IV, Final Fantasy Adventure, and Secret of Mana. After months of work, however, Square decided not to release the game to Western audiences. This was largely due to work being shifted to the development of Final Fantasy IV on the Super Nintendo. Square believed that the best thing would be to release both the Japanese and American games as closely as possible, and in order to do this, both 2 and 3's translations were axed. To avoid confusing Western audiences, Squaresoft named the 4th entry Final Fantasy II and left it at that. Final Fantasy II finally made its debut outside of Japanese markets with the 2003 release of Final Fantasy Origins on the Sony PlayStation. Packed with a remaster of the original game, this new release added full-motion video scenes, an improved soundtrack with better sounds, a full bestiary of the enemies encountered, an item collection gallery of items obtained, and an art gallery of production drawings by Yoshitaka Amano. Beating the game once also unlocked a normal mode, which simply removes the sprint function, auto-targeting in battle, and the more detailed map. Final Fantasy I and II Dawn of Souls included many of the same upgrades, but tweaked the contentious stat leveling system. The action cancel glitch was fixed, but as a compromise it takes far fewer uses of an action to level up an ability. Lastly, just like the first game that's included with this set, a new dungeon is included. Titled the Soul of Rebirth, the in-game dungeon becomes available only after the final boss is defeated, and players take control of most all of the characters that died in the story rather than the 3 main protagonists. The PlayStation Portable release improves on the game even still, by further updating the resolution and introducing 3 additional dungeons along with the one from Dawn of Souls. Unlike the Soul of Rebirth dungeon, these layers, collectively called the Arcane Labyrinth, can be accessed at any time after obtaining the airship, and because of their design, players must complete them numerous times, taking different routes to collect all of their goodies. Also, a defend command was introduced, allowing characters to brace for incoming attacks. The most recent release comes in the form of the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster series, which includes the first 6 games of the franchise. This collection aims to make each of the games more unified, and as such, numerous tweaks were made to ensure Final Fantasy II plays more like its brethren. The The speed in which attributes are increased is greatly overhauled, essentially removing the need to grind. The biggest caveat of this release is that all additional content from previous releases, from the numerous galleries to the 4 additional dungeons, are all gone. Thus, Final Fantasy II's Pixel Remaster is unfortunately an incomplete experience. I contend that the PSP release is the best way to experience Final Fantasy II. It upholds many of the game's functions largely as intended, but tweaked just enough to limit frustration. The inclusion of most all bonus material, along with the Arcane Labyrinth dungeons, also makes this the most complete version of the game. Hironobu Sakaguchi and his team at Square wasted little time following up Final Fantasy II with its next sequel. The franchise was quickly making its mark on the gaming landscape, and along with Final Fantasy III came the series' first of many spin-offs.